Hello everyone, welcome to this demo on how to use Camera Raw, which is a software that comes with Photoshop to process your raw images into Photoshop and convert them to different file formats. So right now I am in Adobe Bridge, and what we're looking at here are some images that you guys are going to process in a little bit. So I want to make sure that you understand how to open them in Camera Raw, how to process them, and then how to take them to Photoshop so that way you can save them correctly. So let's talk a little bit about what Camera Raw is and for what file format it works for. So one of the things that happen with digital photography is that professional cameras, or cameras that are more advanced like mirrorless cameras and DSLRs, they have the capability of shooting in a file format that is basically using the raw data from your camera. Usually when you're taking pictures in a point and shoot or your cell phone or something like that, it will convert the image or the file format from the camera, the original data, into a JPEG format. And that's usually the extension that you see, for example, in this image right here, you can see that it's .jpeg at the end. The ones that are raw, they have a different extension at the end. It depends on the brand of the camera. For CR2, that is for Canon cameras. NEF is for Nikon, and there are other file formats. Even the iPhone nowadays has a raw file extension that is only for iPhone cameras. So you will see that the normal or the most common used image format is basically .jpeg. But nowadays it's more and more common for cameras to give you the raw data. And the reason is because you are in control of doing some adjustments before you convert it into a JPEG. Traditionally that conversion happens in the camera, and then the camera gives you a JPEG format. But that conversion is happening within the camera, so that means that you're not making any decisions of how that file or information is being compressed into a smaller file format. So JPEG is actually a compressed file. The CR2 that you see here is basically the original information from the camera, and you're able to do some adjustments before it's even compressed, okay? So that gives you a lot of advantage at what you can do. One of the things that I want to show you real quick here is this is how it looks when I'm in my computer, right? You can see the CR2, and then you can see here that's the JPEG, and there's different file formats here because I'm mixing them up. But one of the things that will happen when you start working with your raw data is that it's going to make something that's called a metadata. And I want to explain this before we even go to Camera Raw, because you have to be really careful what you do with that metadata file, so that way you don't lose the adjustments that you do in Camera Raw. So I made a folder here that has inside one raw file, which is this image right here, and then right underneath it has a metadata. So the extension is .xmp. What that means is that the adjustments that I do in Camera Raw are not being applied directly to the image, okay? It's basically a new document that's associated with your file, and as you can see here, it has the same, basically the same number of the same image right here, but the only thing that changes is the extension at the end. Now, when you go to Bridge, sometimes you will see it depends, on the file format. Right now I don't have anything here, but if I go in here, you will see this XMP also right there. One of the things that will happen is that if I move that file that is .xmp away from the same location where your other image is, you will lose, or not lose, temporarily lose. If you move it back again in, then you'll still have the changes. But you want to keep basically those two files together at all times. If I by any chance move this to a different computer or a different USB, and I move the file of the photo and I don't bring this, I won't have the adjustments that I did to the file. So I want to point that before we start working, because when you create a folder with your raw files, you have to make sure that if you move them later, you move everything that's in that folder, so that way you don't lose the information. The good thing about working with Camera Raw, for those of you that have worked in the darkroom or in traditional photography, this is basically your negative. What that means is that you can always go back to the original one and make changes or re-edit it. You're not going to it's non-destructive. You're not going to basically make the edits and they're going to save forever and you don't have the original anymore. That's one of the really good things about your raw file, that you can always go back and re-edit it or take away any adjustments that you have done to it and start from scratch, which is really, really helpful. And I'm going to point that out a little bit more when I go into Camera Raw. So I think I mentioned mostly what you need to be aware of in regarding the metadata and making sure that you keep all that in the same folder as you have your files. And then the other thing is, knowing how to set up your camera to shoot RAW. You can ask me in class and I'll be able to point out depending on what brand you have. Usually, you go to the menu and there's either quality. They have different names depending on the brand where you can basically set up to shoot RAW. Okay. I recommend that you shoot RAW. Photoshop comes with the Camera Raw software. So basically you'll be able to, from now on, to convert, the RAW files to JPEGs. The only drawback of using RAW format is that if you email it to someone, they might not be able to open it if they don't have Photoshop or a software that will be able to, like Lightroom or something like that. They'll be able to read RAW files. But if it's for you to basically process them and share them with someone, then you can basically take care of that yourself. So let's go ahead and see how Camera Raw works. Right now I'm in Adobe Bridge, and one of the cool things about working in Adobe Bridge is that if you click one of the images, it will basically recognize the software that needs to open it, and it will open it there. So I'm basically going to select a couple of these. I'm going to select that one, this one, and this one, and that one. And then I'll go back to the other ones. I'm going to select these right here, and I'm just going to double click on them. And automatically it's going to open in Camera Raw. As you can see, I open all of them, and the way that I did that was I pressed Command on my keyboard and I started clicking on the ones that I wanted to open. So you can see that they were all highlighted before I double click in one of them. And then automatically it opened all of them. So if you open and you only see one image here on the bottom, okay, that means that you didn't click in all of them at the same time. Or they were separated and then it's kind of like dividing them. So you have to be aware of that. I'm going to make my full screen here so you can see a little bit better. And one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to basically walk you through different areas of your workspace. Now, there are things that I'm not going to cover, okay? And the reason is that I could be a whole day talking about how to process Camera Raw, but this is just an introduction to get you going and basically processing your files. Okay, I'm not gonna spend the entire class time today just talking about processing Camera Raw, but I could. So there are things that I'm not gonna cover. Just don't if there's something that you wanted to learn how to do in Camera Raw, just ask me and I will be happy to help you with that. But this is more of an introduction, right, of what you can focus on just to get you started. So having said that, I'm going to basically first start with the bottom part where the images are shown. If you click on a image, it would just showcase that image on big. You can basically also move across with your keyboard with the arrow key, so you can actually go through your images. And every time you go on top of an image, you basically have this right side right here where you're going to be able to make some adjustments to your photograph. There are capabilities of selecting multiple images at once and edit them together at the same time. For example, if I click Command and I click on this one, you can see that they're both highlighted. If I go here, for example, to my exposure and move it higher, both of them are getting lighter. Now, in this case, for this demo, I'm not going to do that because they're all in different scenarios, so that wouldn't work. But if you're shooting in a studio and you're shooting a still life and the lighting is the same or in all of them, you can basically adjust a bunch of images at once. So that's really convenient. But for this demo, I'm just going to focus on one by one, okay? And one of the things I'm going to do is go literally down from high up here all the way to the bottom, going through all the little settings that you have available, okay? Now, one of the things that we have talked about is the idea of the histogram. You will see it here. You will also see it in Photoshop. It's just as an aid, so that way you know how your image, X-ray, I call it, it looks, basically how it's created. And you can tell that is a lot of, shadows, and it also has a lot of brightness. So the reason is because you have the sky here that's really bright, and then you have all this that's on the shade here, really dark. Okay. So I picked this image on purpose because I'm going to try to balance both of those things in Camera Raw. Now, one of the benefits on working in Camera Raw is that it gives you a lot more dynamic range. Since you have the original data of the camera, you basically are able to push, for example, those highlights to be darker, and you can bring up a lot more detail from the shadow or the darker areas of your image. That's something that is really hard to achieve well with a JPEG file because it's already compressed. But with a RAW file, because you have way more information, you're able to bring a lot more detail back. Usually, a RAW file is like double the size of a JPEG file. So that means that there's actually information there that you don't have in a JPEG that you can play with. So that's one thing that you're going to use for aid. So basically understand, this is, I'm going to actually try to push this a little bit to the middle and this one a little bit in to kind of modify my image. Profile, I'm going to leave Adobe Color, but I'm going to go to this area right here where it's going to start focusing on editing my image. Now, the first thing that I always check is the color, right? The color balance. I just had it as shot. But I always try to see, what does it look like in auto. You can see that it changed a little bit, not much. So that's how it was. It's a little bit cooler. That's making it a little bit warmer. But let's say if I put just to change it something to more dramatic, cloudy, so you can see shade. So you can see that all of these will make different effects. Now, tungsten is when you have a hot light, that it's those that get warm, the old ones, not the LEDs. Is basically for that. Fluorescent is basically those tubes that you have in stores and things like that. And the flash, and then custom. Okay, so the custom one I'm going to show you later on during this demo. But for now, I'm just going to put in auto because it's going to get close enough to where I want it. I don't trust it completely. Usually the next step after I do that, I go here to temperature and I decide if I want it warmer by pushing it a little bit to the yellows, or if I want it cooler by going a little bit to the blues. I actually want it warmer because it's like at sunset time, so I feel like it should be a little bit warmer. So I'm going to put it somewhere there. I might switch it later. And I can also change the tint. If I want to take away green or add green, I can do that here. So I made it a little bit warm. I did +10 on this one. And I'm doing this I'm going to exaggerate a lot of things right now for this demo, so that way you guys can really see it. That's one of the things I want to make sure that you guys can see the effects because it's through the screen. So now that I have that, I'm going to move to the next step, which is basically figuring out the exposure. Okay, so do I want it brighter? Yes, I would definitely want it brighter. But one of the things that I do is when I do this, you can see that the sky gets blown away, right? But I'm going to show you that you can basically bring that back. I'm actually going to jump the contrast and go straight to the highlights, and I'm going to lower it so it will bring the sky. You can see how it brings the sky back and the clouds. So I'm going to lower it. One of the things that I recommend is that you can push this all the way to the end just so you can see how it looks, but I would not recommend ever to have it on -100. Okay. I definitely think that it will look good on the screen, but when you print it, it will not look great. So try to always go all the way at the edge and then push it back until you see that it looks good enough, but not all the way, down. The contrast, that's subjective. I think that this one can benefit from a little bit of contrast. So I'm going to do +5. I usually don't do a lot of contrast on my images. So I'm going to keep it kind of low on that end. Shadows is the other part that I can basically play with the exposure in terms of I can decide, what, I want a little bit of less exposure, but maybe I want to bring the shadows to be brighter. And I did that decision because I rather keep the sky as darker as I can. And that's going to allow me, if I bring the entire exposure, you see the sky goes down and I can do that, but then I can bring the shadows up that it will only affect that foreground basically. So that's giving you a little bit of brightness there. And I'm exaggerating just so you can see the difference of the image. I wouldn't edit this image like this, but just so you can see the difference of how it was before. Now I'm keeping the sky kind of dark, but then all this foreground basically got a lot brighter, and that would be really hard to do in a JPEG. You would have to take it in Photoshop and do masking, and that would have been a headache. Here, you can adjust it really easily. Now, whites is basically similar to highlights. Anything that's white, you can make it darker. So I'm going to make it a little bit darker. So the skies, so a little bit darker. The blacks, if you erase the blacks, you'll see that the shadows will get brighter. But in this case, I actually want to add a little bit of contrast. So I'm going to do like -1 or something like that to make the blacks a little bit deeper. Okay, so now that's where I'm at. Now I'm going to go to this part right here that most people get confused that you're basically sharpening your image, but it's not really sharpening your image. This one gives you texture. And if you're in doubt, the cool thing about doing camera raw is that you can get crazy with it and kind of like move your, the angle here all the way to the end, right? And you're not going to ruin it. If you want to go back to 0, you can click at any moment the little triangle twice and it goes back to 0. Okay, so again, if I push it all the way and you don't like it, you can double click it and it goes back to 0. Or you can literally just select that and type 0 on your keyboard and it will go back to 0. Okay, so you're not committing to anything. Okay, remember that even if I close this window, you can always go back to the original. Okay, it's not actually changing your image forever. Okay, so you can definitely play with this and get crazy and have some fun. Like if you want to do something like really crazy, you can definitely do something like that. That's not my style. I would not do something like that, but you can get really crazy with these sliders. So I'm gonna bring them back to 0, and dehaze also. So these three right here, let me tell you what they do. They're kind of self-explanatory. The textures, when you look at it, it looks like it's adding texture. And what it's doing is adding contrast. All of these basically add contrast to your image in different algorithm. So the texture one makes it look like it has more texture. The clarity, it kind of like, the whole word explains it. It kind of tries to create some clarity in your image. Almost like if I do this, you see it's softer. And if I go the other way, it just brings it to be a little bit clearer. But again, be careful with these. Don't get too excited. It might look good on the screen and an iPhone, but if you really want to print your pictures, it will start looking a little bit weird. The same with dehaze. Dehaze works great, like for example, underwater photography, something like that. If you want to like take that, haze from the water, this works great for that kind of stuff. So you can play with these. It will behave differently depending on your image. So there's no like right number for any of these that I can tell you like, oh, this is what you should do. That's not my style of teaching either. I definitely think that you should explore and find what works for your image. My only recommendation is don't, go all the way on your sliders. That definitely will not be good. But you can experiment and find the type of imagery that you like. I tend to like images that I don't push them a lot. I try to keep them looking natural, but that's just my style. The clarity I actually use from these three the most, just to give it a little bit of oomph to my image. In the dehaze, sometimes I use it. The texture, I don't tend to use it that much. I feel like it can start looking kind of weird if you push it too much, but that's just a taste thing. So let's assume that I like that right now. Vibrance and saturation, these are affecting more the color. So these were more the contrast. These is more the colors of your image. Vibrance is taking those midtones and colors that are not too saturated and kind of bringing them up. So you can see how the greens kind of pop in the sky also a little bit when I do that. It's adding saturation, but it's not, like saturation. If I push it up, you will see the difference that it's like everything gets saturated. You see, and it looks very saturated. The other one is more subtle. So I tend to use more vibrance. If I want to add a little bit more color to my image, I will push this one a little bit high like that, but not the saturation to not, oversaturate my image. So those are the basic area of the editing that we have right here. Oh, cancel. So now that we are going to move to, there's more, as you can see, this was just the basic window right here. So we were just under the basic. So this is the area that most of you are going to spend time while you're working in Camera Raw. There are other things that you could do. Curve is similar. You have highlights, lights, darks, and shadows that you can basically, go in and manually adjust, or you can use the sliders if you can basically adjust even further the sky. You can see that it's getting it even darker. So you could do something like that. And you can also work with the lights. I'm going to keep that one in 0, and then the shadows too. But from this one, it seems like the sky will be the only one that I can benefit from. And then detail, you have sharpening here. So you can basically sharpen your image by moving the slider. That can be very helpful. One of the things that you can do is if you hold Option down, it will make your image black and white while you're moving the slider. And the idea of that is that you focus more on the sharpness of the image without being distracted of how it looks with the color. So it's just as a visual aid, so you can basically, adjust your image better. My suggestion is that you don't pass over 100 if you don't really need it. If you go all the way here, we'll start doing like weird things to your image at the edges. How sharpening works, and I'll explain this in Photoshop, is basically just adding contrast to the edges of your image. So anything that the computer identifies that is an edge, because there's a difference in contrast and color and all that, it will try to like, oh, that's the edge of something, I'm going to add more contrast there to give the illusion that it's sharper. So, sharpening doesn't really fix your image if it's blurry. It enhances images that are already sharp. Okay, so that's a really good difference to understand versus, people assuming that if an image is blurry, oh, I'm just going to sharpen it in Photoshop. It doesn't work like that. If it's blurry, it's just going to stay blurry with a little bit more contrast, basically. So just be careful with the slider. If you got to 100, look at it carefully. I suggest that you zoom in, okay, when you're doing this, so you can basically see what it's doing to the edges. I feel like that's overdoing it on this image. I'm going to overdo it here so you can see it. It starts adding grain and all that. So I would, go lower, something like that. So it's sharper, but it's not, super bad. One of the things that you have here, you have this little triangles on the side. Okay. And I brought it down because I want to show you masking. Now, if you slide it, you won't see anything happening. And this is like a little secret that not a lot of people know, but it's hidden, and on top of that, you need a shortcut to make it work well. So you have sharpening, right? Let's assume that I want to over sharpen it. Let's do 100. I'm going to click here, right? And you have masking, and you're like, oh, this is not doing anything, but it's actually doing. And I'm going to show you a trick on how to make it work correctly. I'm going to zoom out by pressing Command 0. If you hold Option down, I'm clicking Option and holding it down while I'm sliding this, it's basically going to show you what it's doing. Now, everything that's white is being sharpened, and everything that's black is not being sharpened. So the masking, what it's doing is basically identifying what are the edges and only applying the sharpness to the edges. So the further you go on the slider, less things will get sharpened. And that's how I like it. I don't want to sharpen the sky because the sky doesn't need to be sharp. It's only, the things in the foreground. So, if I keep going, all the way here, you can see that the main thing that's being sharpened is the edge of the mountain, on the top, and then some detail. So I kind of like that. You can do a little bit more, let's say like here. So mostly the foreground is being sharpened, but not the sky. So I think that's the best way to go. If you zoom in, you will see the difference a little bit more. I don't know if you can tell, but here it's a little bit softer than what it is right here. Okay. And there is basically, if you go down here at the bottom, you can cycle between the before and after. So you can see it in two sides. So right now I can see, this is how it was before. This is how it's looking right now. So you can see the sharpness, but you can see that the sky, stayed about the same. But when you see the rocks, you can see that they're sharper right there. So you can definitely do that, and cycle to do them. And then, you have different options on how to see it. If you cycle through this, you can go different up and down and all that. If you go here on the one on the right, then it just goes between the two. Actually, let's zoom out so you can see what we have done so far. So this one right here on the right, if you click on it, that's how it was the image before. this is what it's looking right now. It's very dramatic, the change, right? Like this is basically the raw information from the camera, and this is what we have done so far. And that's not only with the sharpening, that's also with the basic adjustments that we have done. So that was the detail. I know, sorry, I went a little bit long on that one. Now we have color mixer. Okay, so you can basically play a little bit here with the colors. I'm not going to play with this image and the colors, but you can definitely, play with that. And you can make your image black and white as well. Okay, you have saturation, you have luminance here, so you can, play with color. I usually do that in Photoshop. And the same with this stuff. I do all my color adjustment in Photoshop because the thing that I'm trying to do in Camera Raw is just get the colors globally how I want them. And then when I go to Photoshop, then I start editing my image more in regional areas. So I don't have to adjust anything with detail here. So I'm going to skip those two to save a little bit of time. And then we have optics. That's something that could be very useful. If you have used profile corrections, it will basically identify the camera that you use and the lens that you use, and then apply adjustments according to that lens and camera that distort your image. So right now, if you see the edges of the image got lighter, and also it kind of warped the image to basically fix the distortion that the lens that I had on give the image. So if I click here, so that's with the adjustment, and if I click it again, that's without the adjustment, and that's with. You can see how in the edges it got a little bit lighter, and you can see that here it has my lens, and I can still go in and basically distort a little bit more or adjust the vignette. So if I push it a little bit, to either side, you can see how it affects the image according to my lens. And then here you have other options that we're not going to do that to transform the image because we're going to do that in Photoshop. And then you have here further adjustments on effect that you can affect the grain or the vignette further, so you can get that effect. But I'm going to show you a couple more tricks in Photoshop on how to do that correctly. This in Camera Raw will make sense if you just want to get this file to a JPEG just to send it to someone, and you're not going to take it to Photoshop. Then I would do those things here. But in the workflow that I'm going to show you guys, we're going to do more hardcore editing in Photoshop. So it doesn't make sense to do it here. And then the same, calibration, the shadows and all that. I think that all the thing that regarding color, I'd rather do it in Photoshop. So I think the basic one here is the one that you should focus the most. Okay. And there are a bunch of other tools that you have here on the side. Let me go to a different image just to play with it a little bit. Let's assume this one. Let me just show you one thing that I think will help you. So let's zoom back in here. Okay, so one of the things that you can do is you can crop your image within here. Okay, so you can go here and basically, crop your image if you want to do that. I do not want to crop this image, so I don't, want to do that. But one thing I definitely want to do is I'm noticing that this house, the horizon might be crooked. So you have here an angle slider, but besides here on the right side, you have this little symbol that we have it in Photoshop too, but I think it's good if you get it straight, in Camera Raw. So you first have to click the cropping tool, and then you have this that we used already in Photoshop, and you can basically drag it across the ceiling and see, boom, there you go. Now that's straight, and I can double click it and approve it. So you do have a couple tools that are similar than Photoshop, like Healing Brush. And I'm not going to explain these because I'm going to explain them in Photoshop, but once you learn them in Photoshop, you can basically decide to use them here, all the brush and the settings. So we're going to come back to some of these settings later on. That's why I'm not explaining them right now. But the one thing, let's see, there was one thing I wanted to show you from here. I think that one was the main one, because the other one I'm going to show you in Photoshop. But let me go and show you, for example, another image that we can edit before we go and do the next lab. So this one right here, I think it was a good example of bringing detail back from the shadow. This is like a really old image from a really bad camera. But the camera shot raw, so we have more information that would normally you would have. So one of the things that I'm going to have you guys do in your lab is basically bring information from that top part that is really dark. And you have to use the exposure, Obviously, you're going to use the highlights because you have to darken it, okay, so the table doesn't get blown out. And the shadows, you're going to bring them back, and now you can see the wall on the back, right? If this was a JPEG, you would never be able to do that. You would never be able to get that detail on that wall back like how it's looking right now. So you have to go through these and play with them and try to get as much information as you can from that area, but looking naturally, right? I don't want you to like, make everything look really weird by making it too bright, because if we exaggerate it, yes, it will definitely look really bad. So you want to get it to a point that it looks good, right? It looks natural, and you can still see detail out there, versus how it was originally that you can barely see anything in that wall. Okay, so you just want to see a little bit more detail and try to keep this bright enough, but not too bright that it's, overexposed. Okay, so this is something that I want you guys to edit, and I'm going to let you figure out all the details here so you can play with them and adjust them. And same with this one. You can play with this image. I'm going to give you this one. And then the other thing that I didn't explain, because I don't usually do it here, is make an image black and white. That's something that I rather do in Photoshop, but you can do it black and white right here. Okay. And one of the things that you have is the black and white mixer, and you can basically play with these sliders. So for example, I know that most of these things are yellow, so I can make it look almost like it's snow by playing here. I can play with the greens also. I'm gonna make them brighter. Let's get the blues, the sky. Okay, if I move the blue, I know the sky is blue, I can make it darker. So that's a little bit more dramatic. Let's see, purples, magenta's not doing much. So I think the blues are the only ones. And what about the aquas? There we go. So you can see a difference. Let's see it before and after. So that's how it was before, and I made it look a little bit more dramatic. So that's if you want to do black and white. But again, I try to do this in Camera Raw, but I just want to show you that you can basically do all the adjustments that you need in a photograph within Camera Raw. It's very similar for those of you that have tried Lightroom. It's very similar to Lightroom. So you can basically, if you're aware of how to use that, you'll be very familiar on how to use all of these sliders. So those are kind of basic adjustments. Now, let's assume that you're ready to export these or to open them. There's a couple of different ways that you can do that, okay? You have one option is to select your images. So basically, I would have to go down here and press Command A, so all of them are selected. Or you can click the ones that you want to open. Let's say I only want to open these two, okay? And you have a couple of options, okay? The first option is you can click Done. If you click Done, it's going to save the changes that you did, but nothing is going to happen, okay? So basically, if you go to Camera Raw, you will see the XMP file that was going to be created, but the images are not going to be transformed into a JPEG, and you're not going to open them to Photoshop, okay? So that's one option. So one option would be to click Done. It's not like you're going to lose anything. It's just that nothing is going to happen. It's just going to keep the information that you did saved, but it's not going to actually apply it to your image, okay? Now, the next step is to open. So if I click open, it will open the two images in Photoshop, okay? And it will also save the XMP file in Bridge, okay? So that's the other option that you have. Now, the third option that you have is that if you go to your images here, you have this little symbol right here, 3 dots, and then you have this one. If I click here, basically it will open this window that's going to tell you where you want to save it. Now, all of this stuff, I'm very familiar with Photoshop and Camera Raw, but this year they just changed Camera Raw. So it took me a little bit like, where do they move that? Because it used to be right where it was cancel, done, and open that I just show you right here at the bottom. It used to be down here, but now it's like all the way here in the image, so you can actually open this window. So it's a little bit hard to find if you don't know. Like I was looking and I was like, where is it? And it was just right here. So you have to click this little symbol, and it has like a download kind of symbol. So once you open this window, it's basically you can transform this raw format into your JPEG, and you can select where you want to save it. So you can select the folder, where you want to save it to. Let's just do one right here just for the fun of it and put JPEG so you can see what happens, and then create. And then I can select that folder. I can decide if I want to rename it here. I can decide what file extension I want. I can, decide the resolution, what size I want it. If I want to resize it to a specific pixels, I can do that here. I'm just going to keep it, the original file size, just as a JPEG. So I'm going to click save, and you're going to see that it's going to start processing them. It says 2 remaining right here in the bottom left. So it's right now it's like processing only the 2 that I did. Okay, and now it's done. Now if I click done, you will see if I go back to Bridge, basically it will have the folder right here that I just created, and inside that folder it has my 2 images as JPEGs. Okay, so there they are with the edits that I did. Okay, so that's the way of converting them to JPEG. Now if I go back here and you can see that it has the black and white, right? And I told you that it's going to create the XMP. You will see it right here, RR02XMP. So it has the XMP right next to it. Okay, so if I double click here on the Camera Raw, it will open automatically in Camera Raw. And you can still, go back to your original image at any point. You see, now it went back to the original one. Or you can slide the sliders in any way you want. So you're not really losing any of that, even if you adjust your image. And if I click done, for example, and I go to Bridge again, this one. If I delete this, I'm going to actually delete it so you can see what happens. Move to trash. It's going to ask me, do you really want to delete that? I'm going to press OK. You see my image went back to the color. So what's making the adjustments of this image is basically this file right here. Without this file, nothing is happening to this image. It's just actually the original one. Okay, so now let's do one more lab before I let you go. Sorry, this has been a long one. I could actually be even longer doing this, but I think I'm going to try to keep it simple, and I'm rushing through it, but let me know if you have any further questions. So one thing I want to do now is show you a little trick that you can do. And I'm going to do that one. Let's do this CR2 and let's do this one. I think that should be enough. Okay. So now one of the things that I mentioned is that you could adjust multiple images at once. I can show you real quick how to do that. If you select here and this one, you can basically just adjust, your image according, and because they're in the background that they're shot the same way, both of them will look good. But one of the things that I want to show you is how you can use that to your advantage to adjust color. So here, let's start with this one. I have, this box that I was shooting for a friend, and I put this card here and I put this card. This is what we call a gray card. And this card right here is guaranteed to be neutral, meaning that it's pure gray. It doesn't have any shift in color. So if I know that and I've put that in the picture, obviously this is not the final picture. This is just my test picture to get the lights and figure out the color. I can basically use this card here in Camera Raw to calibrate the colors without having to guess what the colors should look like, because your monitor might not be calibrated, your camera might not be calibrated. But if you tell the computer, you know what, this right here should be gray, the camera can adjust all the colors of the picture in relationship to this. So how to do that is really easy. Right here where we are in white balance, you have this little eyedropper. If you click on it and then you just click here, it's hard to tell, but it actually corrected the colors according to that color, because it noticed, you know what, that was actually had a little bit of red in it. So that means that the picture is off in the colors, and then it fixed the whole image according to that. So that's a really useful tool. And, you can buy these, on B&H or Amazon or anything like that, or Adorama. And it's something that I always have in my bag. So if I'm shooting something that I care about, that is important, I will always shoot the card in the same lighting condition to calibrate the color. So that way I take all the guessing away. So instead of trying to figure out what I want the colors to look by sliding the sliders, I just click there, and the only thing I decide later if I want it a little bit warmer or not. So the thing is that, let's assume that I'm shooting this card. I'm going to go here and select the eyedropper. Oop, I had it selected already. and I click here, even though you didn't see what it did, it actually did something. But I can go now to this image by pressing Command and clicking on this image. And there's this little symbol right here, right under the one of download. If I click that, I can synchronize both images according to the settings that I have on this one. So you can basically edit one image only and then decide I want to synchronize 100 images that I shot that were in the same environment, and all the settings should be the same. So anything that you have checked here will synchronize. I am actually going to keep them all on. I'm going to keep them all on because it doesn't really matter. But the one that I really care was the white balance. So I'm basically going to look at this and it's like, okay, the one that I want is on. I'm going to press OK. And what that did is now this image, the white balance, you can see here that it says custom. It doesn't say auto or as shot because I synchronized it to that white balance that I did on the first one. Okay, so I always photograph my card and then I go here and create that. Okay, so that's something really useful from using Camera Raw. So that way when you go to Photoshop, your images are looking correctly in color, in contrast, density. So it's always good to start with good images when you go to Photoshop, so that way you can take the images further. Okay, if you try to take images that are dark, and you're gonna have a headache trying to make it look right before you even start creating composites or interesting designs. So you want to make sure that images that you take them through Camera Raw. And now that we did this, I'm just going to show you. I'm only going to open one, but once I have it here, if I just click open, it will automatically open the image in Photoshop. Okay, so right now we're in Photoshop. There we go. So now you can start working with Photoshop, editing your image further and playing with it. Okay, so that's basically what Camera Raw is going to be. It's going to be our kind of like our lobby area that we're going to check in, fix the images, and now take it to the room to Photoshop. Okay, so it's really important that you go to that process if you have the capability of making your image look as best as possible, so that way you have a good image to start with in Photoshop. Now let me go back to Bridge. I don't think I forgot anything about here. Is there anything else I wanted to show you? I don't think I need. Well, there was one thing actually. I'm glad I remember. I am actually working with Camera Raw files, but Camera Raw has the capability of opening JPEG. So that's why I put this JPEG also here. If I go and right click on top of the images, it's going to say open in Camera Raw. If I double click, by default, it will open in Photoshop because it's a JPEG. Okay. So it will not go directly to Photoshop. But if I right click on top of it, I can go to open in Camera Raw, and I will still have the options of all the things that I did in Camera Raw with the raw files. It's not going to behave as well because I don't have as much information, but it will behave similarly. I can actually, fix my exposure. I can fix, the white balance to auto and see how that looks, and then figure out what I want to do with the highlights and, play around with my image a little bit. So you can basically take advantage of these sliders with any image. It doesn't have to be a Camera Raw. But again, if you go here to white balance, you will see that you don't have all the options of the white balance because it's not a Camera Raw. So you can't, select tungsten like a normal, raw file you would. But the other stuff, that works, pretty similar. You don't have the same dynamic range that you have in a Camera Raw. So you see like, it doesn't affect the image as much as the other one, but you can still play with it with your image. So I just want to point that out because some people think that Camera Raw only works with raw file, but it doesn't. You can actually open any type of file. Well, TIFF, JPEG and things like that. And edit your images here before you take them to Photoshop. So that was a lot of information. Sorry that I went a little bit too quick, but I didn't want to make it super long. If I forgot something, I will remind you in class. There's some things that I didn't went over. You definitely can see at the bottom that you can change stars, and you will see some tools here, but we will get to those in Photoshop. And there's actually one thing here that you can do is show clipping mask. So for example, if I click here on the histogram, and that Photoshop has it too, you will see anything that's blown out that is too bright. It will basically show you as an aid. So when you're editing your image, you can basically adjust it so that way you can bring that down a little bit. In this case, I don't care about that because it's fire. It should be very bright, right? And there's, one other area here that you can see the clipping mask that is clipping, sorry, the highlights. So anyway, that was a really quick intro. I hope that this was helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you all soon.